Chapter 5 of the History of the Caliph Vathek by William Beckford. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. In the midst of these transactions the embassy returned, which had been sent in pious times to Mecca. It consisted of the most reverend mullahs, who had fulfilled their commission and brought back one of those precious besoms which are used to sweep the sacred Kaaba, a present truly worthy of the greatest potentate on earth. The Caliph happened at this instant to be engaged in an apartment by no means adapted to the reception of embassies, though adorned with a certain magnificence, not only to render it agreeable, but also because he resorted to it frequently and stayed a considerable time together. Whilst occupied in this retreat, he heard the voice of Bababalouk calling out from between the door and the tapestry that hung before it. Here are the excellent Mahomet Ebn Edris al-Shafei and the seraphic al-Muhaddethin, who have brought the besom from Mecca, and with tears of joy entreat they may present it to your majesty in person. Let them bring the besom hither, it may be of use, said Vathek, who was still employed, not having quite racked off his wine. How? Said Bababalouk, half aloud and amazed. Obey, replied the Caliph, for it is my sovereign will. Go instantly, vanish, for here will I receive the good folk who have thus filled thee with joy. The eunuch departed muttering, and bade the venerable train attend him. A sacred rapture was diffused amongst these reverend old men. Though fatigued with the length of their expedition, they followed Bababalouk with an alertness almost miraculous, and felt themselves highly flattered, as they swept along the stately porticos, that the Caliph would not receive them like ambassadors in ordinary in his hall of audience. Soon reaching the interior of the harem, where, through blinds of Persian, they perceived large soft eyes, dark and blue, that went and came like lightning, penetrated with respect and wonder, and full of their celestial mission, they advanced in procession towards the small corridors that appeared to terminate in nothing, but nevertheless led to the cell where the Caliph expected their coming. What? Is the commander of the faithful sick? Said Ebn Edris al-Shafei in a low voice to his companion. I rather think he is in his oratory, answered al-Muhaddethin. Vathek, who heard the dialogue, cried out, What imports it you how I am employed? Approach without delay. They advanced, and Bababalouk almost sunk with confusion, whilst the Caliph, without showing himself, put forth his hand from behind the tapestry that hung before the door, and demanded of them the besom. Having prostrated themselves as well as the corridor would permit, and, even in a tolerable semicircle, the venerable al-Shafei, drawing forth the besom from the embroidered and perfumed scarves in which it had been enveloped, and secured from the profane gaze of vulgar eyes, arose from his associates, and advanced, with an air of the most awful solemnity, towards the supposed oratory. But with what astonishment, with what horror was he seized! Vathek, bursting out into a villainous laugh, snatched the besom from his trembling hand, and, fixing upon some cobwebs that hung suspended from the ceiling, gravely brushed away till not a single one remained. The old men, overpowered with amazement, were unable to lift their heads from the ground, for, as Vathek had carelessly left the tapestry between them half drawn, they were witness to the whole transaction. Their tears gushed forth on the marble. Al-Muhaddethin swooned through mortification and fatigue, whilst the Caliph, throwing himself backward on his seat, shouted and clapped his hands without mercy. At last, addressing himself to Bababalouk, My dear Black, said he, go regale those pious poor souls with my good wine from Shiraz, and, as they can boast of having seen more of my palace than any one besides, let them also visit my office courts, and lead them out by the back steps that go to my stables. Having said this, he threw the besom in their face, and went to enjoy the laugh with Carathis. Bababalouk did all in his power to console the ambassadors, but the two most infirm expired on the spot. The rest were carried to their beds, from whence, being heartbroken with sorrow and shame, they never arose. The succeeding night Vathek, attended by his mother, ascended the tower to see if everything were ready for his journey, for he had great faith in the influence of the stars. The planets appeared in their most favourable aspects. The Caliph, to enjoy so flattering a sight, supped gaily on the roof, and fancied that he heard during his repast loud shouts of laughter resound through the sky, in a manner that inspired the fullest assurance. All was in motion at the palace. Lights were kept burning through the whole of the night. The sound of implements and of artisans finishing their work, the voices of women and their guardians who sung at their embroidery, all conspired to interrupt the stillness of nature and infinitely delight the heart of Vathek, who imagined himself going in triumph to sit upon the throne of Solomon. The people were not less satisfied than himself. All assisted to accelerate the moment which should rescue them from the wayward caprices of so extravagant a master. The day preceding the departure of this infatuated prince was employed by Carathis in repeating to him the decrees of the mysterious parchment, which she had thoroughly gotten by heart, and in recommending him not to enter the habitation of any one by the way. For well thou knowest, added she, how liquorish thy taste is after good dishes and young damsels. Let me, therefore, enjoin thee to be content with thy old cooks, who are the best in the world, and not to forget that in thy ambulatory seraglio there are 36 pretty faces which Bababalouk hath not yet unveiled. I myself have a great desire to watch over thy conduct, and visit the subterranean palace, which no doubt contains whatever can interest persons like us. There is nothing so pleasing as retiring to caverns. My taste for dead bodies and everything like mummy is decided, and I am confident thou wilt see the most exquisite of their kind. Forget me not then, but the moment thou art in possession of the talismans which are to open to thee the mineral kingdoms and the centre of the earth itself, fail not to dispatch some trusty genius to take me and my cabinet, for the oil of the serpents I have pinched to death will be a pretty present to the Giaour, who cannot but be charmed with such dainties. Scarcely had Carathis ended this edifying discourse when the sun, setting behind the mountain of the Four Fountains, gave place to the rising moon. This planet, being that evening at full, appeared of unusual beauty and magnitude in the eyes of the women, the eunuchs, and the pages, who were all impatient to set forward. The city re-echoed with shouts of joy and flourishing of trumpets. Nothing was visible but plumes nodding on pavilions, and aigrettes shining in the mild lustre of the moon. The spacious square resembled an immense parterre, variegated with the most stately tulips of the east. Arrayed in the robes which were only worn at the most distinguished ceremonials, and supported by his vizir and Bababalouk, the Caliph descended the grand staircase of the tower in the sight of all his people. He could not forbear pausing at intervals to admire the superb appearance which everywhere courted his view, whilst the whole multitude, even to the camels with their sumptuous burdens, knelt down before him. For some time a general stillness prevailed, which nothing happened to disturb but the shrill screams of some eunuchs in the rear. These vigilant guards, having remarked certain cages of the ladies swagging somewhat awry, and discovered that a few adventurous gallants had contrived to get in, soon dislodged the enraptured culprits. The majesty of so magnificent a spectacle was not, however, violated by incidents like these. Vathek meanwhile saluted the moon with an idolatrous air, that neither pleased Morakanabad nor the doctors of the law, any more than the vizirs and the grandees of his court, who were all assembled to enjoy the last view of their sovereign. At length, the clarions and trumpets from the top of the tower announced the prelude of departure. Though the instruments were in unison with each other, yet a singular dissonance was blended with their sounds. This proceeded from Carathis, who was singing her direful orisons to the Giaour, whilst the negresses and mutes supplied slower bass without articulating a word. The good Mussulmans fancied they heard the sullen hum of these nocturnal insects which presaged evil, and importuned Vathek to beware how he ventured his sacred person. On a given signal, the great standard of the Caliphat was displayed, 20,000 lances shone around it, and the Caliph, treading loyally on the cloth of gold which had been spread for his feet, ascended his litter amidst the general awe that possessed his subjects. The expedition commenced with the utmost order, and so entire a silence, that even the locusts were heard from the thickets on the plain of Catoul. Gaiety and good humour prevailing, 6 good leagues were passed before the dawn, and the morning star was still glittering in the firmament, when the whole of this numerous train had halted on the banks of the Tigris, where they encamped to repose for the rest of the day. The 3 days that followed were spent in the same manner, but on the 4th the heavens looked angry, lightnings broke forth in frequent flashes, re-echoing peals of thunder succeeded, and the trembling Circassians clung with all their might to their ugly guardians. The Caliph himself was greatly inclined to take shelter in the large town of Golkissar, the governor of which came forth to meet him, and tendered every kind of refreshment the place could supply, but, having examined his tablets, he suffered the rain to soak him almost to the bone, notwithstanding the importunity of his first favourites. Though he began to regret the palace of the senses, yet he lost not sight of his enterprise, and his sanguine expectations confirmed his resolution. His geographers were ordered to attend him, but the weather proved so terrible that these poor people exhibited a lamentable appearance, and as no long journeys had been undertaken since the time of Haroun al-Rashid, their maps of the different countries were in a still worse plight than themselves. Every one was ignorant which way to turn, for Vathek, though well versed in the course of the heavens, no longer knew his situation on earth. He thundered even louder than the elements, and muttered forth certain hints of the bowstring, which were not very soothing to literary ears. Disgusted at the toilsome weariness of the way, he determined to cross over the craggy heights and follow the guidance of a peasant, who undertook to bring him in 4 days to Rocnabad. Remonstrances were all to no purpose. His resolution was fixed, and an invasion commenced on the province of the goats, who spread away in large troops before them. It was curious to view on these half-calcined rocks camels richly caparisoned, and pavilions of gold and silk waving on their summits, which till then had never been covered but with sapless thistles and fern. The females and eunuchs uttered shrill wailings at the sight of the precipices below them, and the dreary prospects that opened in the vast gorges of the mountains. Before they could reach the ascent of the steepest rock, night overtook them, and a boisterous tempest arose, which, having rent the awnings of the palanquins and cages, exposed to the raw gusts the poor ladies within, who had never before felt so piercing a cold. The dark clouds that overcast the face of the sky deepened the horrors of this disastrous night, insomuch that nothing could be heard distinctly but the mewling of pages and lamentations of sultanas. To increase the general misfortune, the frightful uproar of wild beasts resounded at a distance, and there were soon perceived in the forest they were skirting the glaring of eyes which could belong only to devils or tigers. The pioneers, who, as well as they could, had marked out a track, and a part of the advanced guard, were devoured before they had been in the least apprised of their danger. The confusion that prevailed was extreme. Wolves, tigers, and other carnivorous animals, invited by the howling of their companions, flocked together from every quarter. The crashing of bones was heard on all sides, and a fearful rush of wings overhead, for now vultures also began to be of the party. The terror at length reached the main body of the troops, which surrounded the monarch and his harem, at the distance of 2 leagues from the scene. Vathek voluptuously reposed in his capacious litter upon cushions of silk, with 2 little pages beside him of complexions more fair than the enamel of Franguestan, who were occupied in keeping off flies, was soundly asleep, and contemplating in his dreams the treasures of Solomon. The shrieks, however, of his wives awoke him with a start, and instead of the Giaour with his key of gold, he beheld Bababalouk full of consternation. "Sire," exclaimed this good servant of the most potent of monarchs, "misfortune is arrived at its height. Wild beasts, who entertain no more reverence for your sacred person than for that of a dead ass, have beset your camels and their drivers. 30 of the richest laden are already become their prey, as well as your confectioners, your cooks, and purveyors, and unless our holy prophet should protect us, we shall have all eaten our last meal." At the mention of eating the Caliph lost all patience. He began to bellow, and even beat himself, for there was no seeing in the dark. The rumour every instant increased, and Bababalouk, finding no good could be done with his master, stopped both his ears against the hurly-burly of the harem, and called out aloud: "Come, ladies and brothers, all hands to work! Strike light in a moment! Never shall it be said that the commander of the faithful served to regale these infidel brutes." Though there wanted not in this bevy of beauties a sufficient number of capricious and wayward, yet on the present occasion they were all compliance. Fires were visible in a twinkling in all their cages, 10,000 torches were lighted at once. The Caliph himself seized a large one of wax. Every person followed his example, and by kindling ropes' ends dipped in oil and fastened on poles, an amazing blaze was spread. The rocks were covered with the splendour of sunshine. The trails of sparks wafted by the wind communicated to the dry fern, of which there was plenty. Serpents were observed to crawl forth from their retreats, with amazement and hissings, whilst the horses snorted, stamped the ground, tossed their noses in the air, and plunged about without mercy. One of the forests of cedar that bordered their way took fire, and the branches that overhung the path, extending their flames to the muslins and chintzes, which covered the cages of the ladies, obliged them to jump out at the peril of their necks. Vathek, who vented on the occasion 1,000 blasphemies, was himself compelled to touch with his sacred feet the naked earth. Never had such an incident happened before. Full of mortification, shame, and despondence, and not knowing how to walk, the ladies fell into the dirt. "Must I go on foot?" cried one. "Must I wet my feet?" cried another. "Must I soil my dress?" asked a third. "Execrable Bababalouk!" exclaimed all, "outcast of hell! What hadst thou to do with torches? Better were it to be eaten by tigers than to fall into our present condition. We are for ever undone. Not a porter there is in the army, not a courier of camels, has but seen some part of our bodies, and what is worse, our very faces." On saying this, the most bashful amongst them hid their foreheads on the ground, while such as had more boldness flew at Bababalouk. But he, well apprised of their humour, and not wanting in shrewdness, betook himself to his heels along with his comrades, all dropping their torches and striking their tymbals. Part 5